And we know how to do this. There is organic agriculture happening right now in the world in all of these wonderful ways. And I was inspired to learn about how it's happening in my home state. So for much of the past 5 years, I have been talking about this story that I've been calling the Lentil Underground, of a group of farmers who have innovated a farming model and a business model that require neither synthetic fertilizer nor synthetic herbicides, the things that my students are routinely told are necessary. They're not necessary. Farmers who produce good food and good livelihoods without undermining human and environmental health. But just to quickly recap, what is this crisis of industrial agriculture that we need a grassroots response to? We know it's an environmental crisis. This is kind of one of the headlines of that environmental crisis, climate change, because it has this huge time limit on it for us as a species, but of course, all of the other things that Jim mentioned too, some of which might be affecting us or our communities right now, in addition to climate change. It's also, it's a hunger crisis. And this for me is really painful because the excuse that's often given for the need for this input-dependent agriculture, right, is to feed the world and solve the hunger crisis. But, that approach has had multiple decades to do that and clearly hasn't been very successful. So our input-dependent agriculture is also part of our global food security crisis. This is just the numbers on people who don't have enough calories, but there's also many people who don't have the right calories. So if you start getting into micronutrient deficiency or uncertainty about where the next meal is coming from, these numbers go way up. And of course, it's a health crisis, so this has been mentioned. The chronic disease burden that comes from this input-dependent agricultural system, obesity, diabetes. So this is not a system that's working. So yes, we need to have this grassroots response. And what does this grassroots response need to look like? What do we do about this, right? That's what we're here to talk about. And I really think that the answer is we need to design our farming and food systems so that they thrive without these inputs, right? We need to design those kinds of food systems. And those are going to be different regionally. These are regional sustainable food systems that are appropriate to their ecology, which we can understand, as Jim has so beautifully stated, if we're in connection with that ecology. And a really big part of this regional approach to sustainable food systems, I think one of the really critical things that I learned from these farmers in Montana that I spoke with, is crop rotation. That was mentioned earlier today in response to Pesticides 101, that this is a critical part of a food system that is healthy, that is resilient, and that is not input dependent. So here's a picture of one of the farms featured in this book, one of the farms that I visited, one of the farms that sells their pulse crops through Timeless Natural Food that you'll hear from about David. And this is, it looks like a garden map, but this is actually a 2,000 acre farm. This is one of their fields. They farm in strips and they rotate through something like 24 different crops, about a decade-long rotation. And I think this is really, Melinda was talking earlier about, the term innovative, and we've been talking about reclaiming our language. I think this is about the most innovative we get in farming. This is the direction of innovation, I think, is how can you design these complex rotations that meet all these ecosystem service needs within the farm itself. So you don't have to think about how you're going to bring in fertility or bring in pest control. This is a farm that's designed to do those things, as well as provide a good living to these farmers. Also to provide multiple options, right? If you've got 24 different crops in your rotation, if one of them has a bad year, you're not going to totally lose your shirt. So crop rotation, totally central to this whole story of how we're going to move beyond pesticides. And the critical thing in this Montana system that's moving beyond wheat monoculture, hopefully one farm at a time here, input-dependent wheat monoculture, is having a legume in there. So this is what lentils look like mid-season. They can grow in this semi-arid region that has short seasons, and they're providing that critical nitrogen fertility in the rotation. So yeah, you need a cover crop in the rotation for that fertility too. You'll hear more about this also from Dave. But you also, I think what's so brilliant about this is it's something that you can sell as a cash crop typically for more than wheat, but it's also providing, the pest and disease cycle breaking up of having a different family in the rotation and that additional nitrogen fertility. So these little roots are doing all this great work with bacteria, little nitrogen factories in the soil. And as a result, this is a much more climate-friendly way to farm, not using all these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. These are averages. This is an environmental working group graph that probably many of you have seen. And the reason that all those animal products are so high on this graph is that they're all getting fed these feed grains that need so much nitrogen fertilizer. It's a huge part of the climate footprint of our food system is just these feed grains with all this nitrogen fertilizer on the feed grains. The conversion ratio of those calories into human food is lower because it's going through an animal. So it's a lot of nitrogen fertilizer at the end of the day, in addition to the methane emissions, which is what we tend to hear more about. So this is a really big part of getting off of this fossil fuel-based economy. One of the other big industrial inputs that we're relying on is building legumes back into our systems, including our wheat systems. But that's not the whole story. So before I turn the mic over to David, I want to talk a little bit about a paradigm shift, because I think this is at the heart of moving beyond pesticides. And I was chuckling a little bit when the fellow brought up, whatever happened to crop rotation earlier in the Pesticides 101 session, because I imagine that you, wherever you are not the only person thinking, this is not news, right? Frankie Moore LePay wrote Diet for a Small Planet in, I think it was 1971. Farmers have been rotating legumes with grains for at least 10,000 years. Some archaeological evidence suggests it was much earlier than that. And you are all, of course, right. We have the know-how to farm without agrochemicals. We know that agrochemicals are not necessary to feed the world. And in fact, there's a good case to be made that they are getting in the way of global food security. I think the food sovereignty framing has been particularly good at pointing that out. But ultimately, I think for this country, where agriculture is so tightly connected to the myth of manifest destiny and the project of conquest, moving beyond pesticides requires something deeper. It requires moving beyond a John Wayne mental model in our human relations as well as our ecological relations. So I'm going to read you a short, sort of a very brief little manifesto on that. And then you can hear the real story from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So, you can't do it alone. Much like a newly initiated legume farmer, I want to think that lentils are a straightforward substitute for synthetic fertilizer, a cheaper, more environmentally benign alternative. To some extent, this is true. But if that was really all there was to it, there would be no lentil underground, just a smattering of savvy growers rationally applying plant-based nitrogen instead of expensive ammonium nitrate. But the fact is that biological fertility is more than just a different nutrient management approach. It's an entirely different way of life, one in which time and space broaden considerably, and the illusion of control falls apart. Building your soil biologically is not a precise prescription for a particular crop, but a contribution to a larger ecology, subject to independent variables, geologic time, and global biogeochemical cycles. You will not capture all the value on this farm in this year. You cannot individualize your return. To build biological fertility is to build community, to accept interdependence with other creatures, and foster a common benefit. This way of life cultivates a new kind of awareness, a new empathy. You have to pay attention beyond this homestead. You have to pay attention beyond this season. Planting organic lentils and all the other crops that go with them becomes part of who you are, what you are conscious of, how you see the world. It forces you to listen more deeply, more expansively, and it softens, to some extent, the borders of the self. This is the great irony of the lentil underground, or perhaps its secret. What rugged individualism brought together, only community can sustain. So to me, that is really the insight at the heart of the lentil underground. And I'm very pleased to hand the mic over to its renegade in chief, the founding farmer and CEO of Timeless Natural Food, David Oyen.
I'm a third-generation Montana farmer. My grandparents immigrated from Norway. They were farmers, and actually the reason that they came to the United States, ironically, had to do with climate change, and that it was just at the tail end of the Little Ice Age, which was kind of 200 or 300 years, ended kind of mid-1850s. Europe was starving because the climate was cooling dramatically, and anybody that's been to Scandinavia knows that their soils are very rocky, tend not to be very productive. My family was going hungry. My grandparents on one side survived one winter by eating the screenings from the local flour mill. And so anyway, they came to the United States, farmed with horses. The prairies were plowed with steam engines, but basically they were kind of biological farmers in lots of ways. My parents got married in 1930 and started farming shortly thereafter. They were kind of on the cusp of the change from biological agriculture to what these days we call industrial agriculture. Just before my dad bought the farm that I was raised on and currently live on, he took his team of horses to the local tractor dealership and traded them in on a fossil fuel tractor. And that was really kind of, one of the major, points of transition, I guess, in agriculture. That happened in the early 40s. And of course, after World War II, is when we really got into the industrial phase of agriculture with the introduction of off-farm inputs, a lot higher fossil fuel inputs, and pesticides and herbicides that were kind of consequences of the war machine. What do you do with all this chemical industry that was developed? Well, one of the things you could do is sell stuff to farmers. Okay, and my dad was part of that generation. So I moved back to the farm in 1976 after college and knocking around the world a little bit, after doing some of the things that I think you were also involved in, maybe in the 70s. Well, maybe not. I don't know, but probably. Anyway, so I moved back to the farm in 1976, and what I came back to was a crisis. There's a fossil fuel crisis. There was an oil embargo in the early 70s. Fossil fuel skyrocketed. Price of gasoline went from 35 cents a gallon to 48 cents a gallon in a matter of months. But it had a major economic impact on farms. And we were losing farmers. There was a farm crisis. Farmers all across the country were going out of business, and some of them were committing suicide. But also coming back to the family farm, I discovered that there was a chemical crisis in that literally every acre of every farm was hit with herbicides, primarily in our area, sometimes pesticides, every acre, every year, on every farm. And a consequence of that was a health crisis in our local community. Many of the people of my father's generation were dying of a cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which eventually was directly connected to the overexposure of 2,4-D. Sort of ironic that, in the 2000 or the 1001 primer earlier, 2,4-D is now back on the landscape again, as an admixture to, to Roundup, to glyphosate. But anyway, that's what I came back to. You talk about connecting the dots. I was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's a French poet that had the saying, "The future's not what it used to be." And that's pretty much, kind of what it occurred to me. It's like, the future cannot be what it used to be. We have to move on. So, the story of the Lentil Underground, and basically the story of my life the past, 30, 35 years, has to do with what do we do about that future? How do we create that future in a little different scenario? So here's where I'm from. I moved back to that family farm in north central Montana. Conrad is located in the northern Great Plains within an area of the state that's called the Golden Triangle. It's called the Golden Triangle because that is kind of the major wheat production area in the state of Montana. And the other thing that I discovered, when I came back was that, wheat was king in Montana. Had been for, at least a decade before I moved back, and still to a large extent is, in that it was the crop that was grown on virtually every single acre of cultivated ground in Montana, kind of the eastern three-quarters of the state, and it was grown year after year. So we had monocrop wheat and monoculture across the landscape. But the Golden Triangle there gets its name from the wheat production. These were the farmers in the Lentil Underground farm, kind of basically the extended area of the Golden Triangle. The book was written, 5 or 6 years ago, I guess now maybe, or published 2 years ago, but yeah, research 5 or 6 years ago. We now work with about 30 farmers across, certified organic family farmers across the state. This is kind of what they look like. Just regular folks, with dogs, with kids. Some of them are old timers. Have been farming for many years. Some are kids moving back to the family farm. Some are not moving back to the family farm. The couple in the middle there, Doug and Anna Crabtree, are the owners of the farm that Liz showed the field map of. In fact, what they are now doing is they're taking apprentices in a 3-year apprentice program whereby young people primarily, today it's been young people come to the farm, learn about their farming system, learn about organic farming, learn about organic markets. And Doug and Anna's hope is that after a period of 3 years, they will have sufficient training, sufficient know-how, and sufficient connections to actually go out and be organic farmers themselves. So it's not a short-term project. It's a 2 or 3 year project, but you end up with a farm basically at the end of that. And one of the big challenges, as Jim mentioned, going forward is just it's just continuing this legacy with new young farmers and expanding the amount of acres that are organic. This is the kind of landscape that we farm out there. It's a northern Great Plains, so it's treeless, it's gently rolling, and it's semi-arid, meaning that our annual rainfall is between 10 and 14 inches annual. So for the rest of the time, I just want to focus really particularly on lentils and ask some questions. Why would people want to grow them to start with? Why would a cook want to cook with them? Why should you be eating them? And why do you want to do it now? Okay, going to take a quick poll. How many people are lentil eaters in here? All right. You know what? I had the opportunity to travel with Liz. She was kind enough to invite me to travel on her book release tour, and we traveled all over the country. And there weren't too many auditoriums where this many people, this percentage, raised their hand. Okay. So I don't know if it's the co-ops here in the state, in Minneapolis, or just the kind of folks you are. But anyway, we'll look at this. So this is what lentils look like. kind of mid-season. There they are in their pods. But this is really why farmers want to grow them. And that is that there's this miracle of nature where a symbiotic relationship between rhizobia bacteria who live in the soil infect the roots of this family of plants called legumes, lentils being one of them, and they get these big knobs on them, and they have the ability, the bacteria have the ability to capture nitrogen out of the air, which is, mixed in the soil, and provide it for the plant. And it's very few plants that can do that. Wheat, barley, corn, cannot do that. They need nitrogen, and that's part of the reason for the kind of the development of the synthetic nitrogen industry, was to provide nitrogen for crops that can't do that. In our country, it was primarily wheat, but flax and quinoa, and lots of most plants cannot make their own nitrogen. Legumes, in combination with this infection by rhizobia bacteria, can actually capture that, produce enough nitrogen for their own production, and also leave some for the following crop. The other thing about lentils that work in our country is that they are drought tolerant. They're very frost hardy. 30 degrees doesn't bother lentils. Don't worry about it. In fact, you could use these in your orchard as a cover crop, and you'd be fine. They're also shallow rooted versus cereal grain. So, in areas that don't have a lot of rainfall, our number one limiting resource is really water. So part of the beauty of these lentils is that they have a shallow rooting system, whereas wheat has a deeper rooting system. So even though lentils, maybe rob moisture, if you will, take moisture from the top part of the soil, it leaves some for wheat for the following crop for the following year. For better or worse, they're very short in stature, kind of grow 12 to 16 inches tall, and it's a dry land crop. They don't even like too much water. Susceptible to root rot if they, under irrigation. Probably wouldn't work here in Minnesota, where you have about a 3,000 or a 30 inch rainfall per year. They're also short season annual, about 100 days from planting to harvest, which is something that also works in our environment. We plant one crop a year, seed typically in March or April, and harvest in July or August. That's what the ripe lentil crop looks like. This is lentil crop just starting to bloom, so it's 6 or 8 weeks after emergence. But you can see it's knee high if you're kneeling down in the ground, and it doesn't get much taller than that. What lentils offer in this typically wheat monoculture farming system was biodiversity, in the cereal grain rotations. So that's kind of what wheat looks like at harvest. And lentils they're just a much different crop. They offer a whole different, kind of microenvironment for all the biota that exists. Lentils also break the pest cycles in a cereal grain monoculture. That's what a wheat crop looks like. That's what a lentil plant looks like. And you can see the morphology is much different. That also means actually that the pests that infect one are much different than the pest that infects the other. So doing a crop rotation basically breaks those pest and disease cycles and reduces or eliminates the need for the pesticides that that we're all concerned about. It also offers grade ground shading versus cultivated fallow, which was a typical management system when I moved back to the farm. Well, if you grow a green crop there, it's capturing, rather than the fallow, it's capturing the carbon out of the air. It's providing shade for the ground, reducing or preventing soil erosion. So it's a great rotational crop for wheat. It also builds organic matter and biological activity both above and underground. Okay, in the kitchen, why do you want to cook with them? Well, They cook in they cook in 5 minutes to 30 minutes, so it doesn't take much energy to cook them, but it's also very quick, you know, for current lifestyle. Unlike the dry beans, like pinto beans or black beans, you don't have to soak them. It's a very versatile ingredient. Can be used as, you know, appetizers, soup, salads, all the way to desserts. It was one of the first crops that were domesticated. Okay, so why do you want to eat them? Well, there's no reason not to eat them. They're very high in protein, no cholesterol. It's a great alternative to meat. Dietary fiber, folates. If you're pregnant or concerned about about brain development, folates are very important. Loaded with minerals. Very low glycemic index if you're diabetic or any of your family is diabetic. One of the lowest foods with a glycemic index. Gluten-free, obviously, because it's not related to wheat at all. They're non-GMOs. Interestingly, the entire lentil industry, even the conventional lentil industry, is fighting the development of GMO for lentils, peas, and chickpeas. And the reason for that is they know the market. They know where the market's going. They're also high in antioxidants. Okay, so name me an antioxidant high food. Blueberries, right? Okay, well, fresh basil. Those of you who have gardens, remember that? Oh yeah. Well, then there's lentils. Liz showed a variation of this slide as well. Why do you want to do it now? Because just as climate change impacted my grandparents, and climate change is going to impact, you know, my kids and my grandkids. And lentils is down on the bottom. You may or may not know, last year the United Nations declared as the International Year of the Pulses. And pulses are lentils, dried peas, chickpeas, and beans. This whole class of edible legumes that come in a pod. They were done, UN designated that, you know, for all the reasons, the sustainability reasons, the health reasons, the low moisture requirement reasons. You can look up these websites. Lots of great recipes, lots of great reasons for eating lentils and the other crops. That's our website, timelessfood.com. There's some more pictures, some stories, some recipes on there as well. Okay? Good.